The day my sister Cordelia walked onto that shooting range with her bright red rifle, grown men literally pointed and laughed. I'm talking about former Marines, Army snipers, guys who'd made shots in Afghanistan and Iraq that most people only see in movies. They took one look at her candy apple red rifle and started nudging each other like schoolboys who'd just seen someone trip in the cafeteria. Before we dive in, tell us where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. What is that thing, a Valentine's Day special? One of them called out loud enough for half the range to hear. Another guy actually pulled out his phone to take a picture, probably planning to post it on social media with some joke about women and their need to accessorize everything. But here's what none of those laughing, pointing, supposedly elite marksmen knew. My 23-year-old sister Cordelia had been quietly perfecting her craft for 3 years. While they were bragging about their military service and expensive gear at the local bar, she was out here at dawn when the range was empty and the wind was still, learning to read conditions that would make a meteorologist jealous. See, Cordelia isn't your typical shooter. She's a mechanical engineer who approaches everything like a physics problem waiting to be solved. That bright red rifle they were all mocking. She'd rebuilt it from the ground up, calculated every modification, tested every component until it performed like a precision instrument. The red paint wasn't some girly fashion statement. It was a carefully chosen coating that helped with heat dissipation and gave her better visibility readings for wind direction. Our grandfather Tobias, a Korean War veteran who taught her everything about patience and precision, had passed away just 3 months earlier. That rifle was his legacy, transformed by her engineering mind into something those laughing men couldn't even comprehend. Grandpa Tobias used to tell her, "Cordelia, real precision isn't about having the biggest gun or the loudest voice. It's about understanding your tools and respecting the science behind every single shot." What happened next at 2,900 meters didn't just silence that range. It made every single one of those cocky, dismissive shooters question everything they thought they knew about what a real marksman looks like. Because sometimes the most devastating response to mockery isn't an argument or a comeback. Sometimes it's simply proving that while they were busy running their mouths, you were busy perfecting your craft. That one shot didn't just hit a distant target. It shattered every assumption, every stereotype, and every bit of arrogance that had filled that range with laughter just moments before. And my sister Cordelia, the quiet engineer with the bright red rifle and 3 years of dawn practice sessions, was about to teach some very loud men a lesson in humility they'd never forget. To understand what happened that day, you need to know who Cordelia really is, because she spent most of her life being completely underestimated by everyone around her. Growing up, I was the star of our family. Track and field champion, homecoming queen, the daughter who brought home trophies and college scholarship offers. Cordelia was 3 years younger and the complete opposite. While I was out winning races and dating the quarterback, she was in our garage with our grandfather Tobias, building contraptions that most adults couldn't even understand. Grandpa Tobias was a Korean War veteran who'd earned a Purple Heart and 3 commendations for marksmanship. After the war, he became a machinist, spending 40 years crafting precision parts for aerospace companies. When Cordelia turned 13, she started spending every weekend in his workshop, learning to use lathes and micrometers while other girls her age were at the mall. "That granddaughter of mine has hands like a surgeon and a mind like a computer," he used to tell people. "She sees things the rest of us miss." Our parents, Vivian and Hayes, never quite knew what to make of Cordelia. Mom's a high school English teacher who wanted both her daughters to be social butterflies. Dad runs a successful insurance agency and always hoped one of us would take over the business. They were proud of her engineering degree from Colorado State, sure, but they kept waiting for her to grow out of what they called her tinkering phase. When Grandpa Tobias died last March, it hit Cordelia harder than anyone expected. She'd spent every Sunday with him for the past 10 years, even during college. The day after his funeral, she showed up at his house and asked our grandmother Elena if she could go through his workshop. That's when she found his rifle collection. Grandpa had 6 rifles, all meticulously maintained, each one serving a specific purpose. There were hunting rifles, a couple of military surplus pieces, and one custom long-range rifle he'd built himself in the 1970s but never fired much because ammunition was too expensive back then. "I want to learn," Cordelia told Elena that day. Grandpa always talked about the precision, the mathematics, the patience it required. I want to understand what he loved about it. Elena, who'd been married to a shooter for 53 years, just nodded and handed her the keys to the gun safe. For the next 2 months, Cordelia threw herself into learning everything about long-range shooting. She read ballistics manuals like novels, studied weather patterns, learned about barrel harmonics and bullet flight paths. She found a local instructor named Jim Castillo, a former Army Ranger who ran private lessons at the Rocky Mountain Precision Range. Most people want to learn to shoot fast, Jim told me later. Cordelia wanted to learn to shoot perfect. She started with shorter distances, 300 yards, then 500, methodically working her way up as she mastered each range. Every evening after work, she'd disappear into the garage with Grandpa's old rifle, cleaning it, adjusting it, making modifications that combined his mechanical knowledge with her engineering training. The bright red paint job happened after her first month of practice. I thought it was some kind of rebellion, her way of making the rifle uniquely hers. Turns out she'd researched heat-resistant coatings and discovered that the specific shade of red she chose actually helped with thermal regulation and provided better contrast for reading wind conditions. Everything Grandpa taught me was about precision, she explained to me one night as she worked on the rifle's trigger mechanism. He said tools should be functional first, but there's no reason they can't be beautiful too. Our parents still didn't get it. Dad kept asking when she was going to find a normal hobby, and Mom worried that people would think it was weird for a young woman to spend her weekends at a shooting range. They both assumed it was grief talking, that she'd eventually move on to something more appropriate. The Rocky Mountain Precision Range became Cordelia's second home. She'd arrive at sunrise most Saturdays, when the air was still and the serious long-range shooters were just setting up. For 3 months, she quietly built her skills, earning respect from instructors, and a few regular shooters who appreciated her methodical approach and obvious dedication. Nobody knew she was consistently hitting targets at distances that would impress military snipers. She kept detailed logs, recorded every shot, analyzed every miss until she understood exactly why it happened. She wasn't just learning to shoot. She was becoming a precision shooter. Everything changed the weekend Garrett Voss and his crew decided to turn the Rocky Mountain Precision Range into their personal proving ground. Garrett was a former Marine Scout sniper who'd done 3 tours in Afghanistan and never let anyone forget it. He'd roll up to the range every Saturday morning in his lifted Ford F-250 with Semper Fi decals covering the back window, followed by his buddies Rick and Danny, both ex-military guys who treated the shooting range like their private clubhouse. They'd set up their expensive rifles, all black tactical gear and $1,000 scopes, talking loud enough for everyone to hear about their confirmed kills and real-world experience. Within a month, they'd basically claimed the long-range section of the range as their territory. "This ain't a hobby for us," Garrett announced one morning to anyone within earshot. "We're maintaining combat readiness. Some of these weekend warriors need to understand there's a difference between playing soldier and being one." Jim Castillo, the range instructor who'd been working with Cordelia, tried to keep the peace. The range was big enough for everyone, he'd say, but Garrett's group made it clear they considered recreational shooters beneath their notice. They'd make comments about civilians playing with real man's toys, and how the range was getting too soft by letting anyone with a hunting license show up. For 2 months, Cordelia managed to avoid direct confrontation by arriving early and staying in the shorter range sections. But she was getting frustrated because her real practice, the long-distance work that honored Grandpa Tobias's legacy, required the 1,000-yard-plus range where Garrett's crew had set up their weekend kingdom. The first direct conflict happened on a Saturday morning in late September. Cordelia had arrived at her usual dawn slot and was setting up at the 800-yard line when Garrett's truck pulled up. She watched him scan the range, his face darkening when he saw her bright red rifle. "Jim," Garrett called to the range officer. "I thought we talked about keeping the serious shooting areas clear during peak training hours." Jim looked uncomfortable. "Garrett, she's a paying customer, same as you. Been coming here for months, never caused any problems." "Problems?" Garrett walked closer to where Cordelia was quietly adjusting her scope. "Look at that thing. It's painted like a toy. This is a precision rifle range, not a carnival." Cordelia kept working, checking her equipment with the same methodical care she'd learned from her grandfather. She wasn't going to be baited into an argument. "Hey, sweetheart," Rick called out, Garrett's buddy with the beer gut and the loud mouth. "You sure you're at the right place?" The beginner classes are Thursday evenings. That's when Danny joined in, the third member of their little brotherhood. Maybe she's here for Instagram photos. That red rifle would look great with the mountains in the background. Other shooters were starting to notice the tension. A few regular customers who knew Cordelia looked uncomfortable, but nobody wanted to get involved with 3 former military guys who'd made it clear they owned this part of the range. Cordelia finished her setup and moved to take her position. That's when Garrett decided to escalate things. "Hold up there, little girl," he said, stepping directly into her line of sight. "This isn't a county fair. Real shooters are trying to work here, and frankly, your toy gun is a distraction." For the first time, Cordelia looked up and made direct eye contact. Her voice was quiet but clear. "I'm not bothering anyone. I'm just here to practice." "Practice?" Garrett laughed, loud enough for the entire range to hear. "Lady, you've got a rifle that looks like it belongs in a kid's bedroom and you want to practice with the big boys?" The range had gone quiet now. Even shooters at the pistol range had stopped to watch the confrontation. "Tell you what," Garrett continued, clearly enjoying the audience. "If you can hit anything past 2,000 meters, I'll personally apologize and buy you dinner. But when you can't, because that toy gun isn't capable of real precision work, you pack up and find yourself a more appropriate range. Deal?" Cordelia stood there for a long moment, and I could see something change in her expression. It wasn't anger exactly, but a kind of cold determination that reminded me exactly of Grandpa Tobias when someone told him something couldn't be built to proper specifications. "What's the longest target you have here?" she asked Jim quietly. 2,900 meters, Jim answered, looking nervous about where this was heading. Cordelia nodded once. "Then let's make this interesting." The moment Cordelia asked about the 2,900-meter target, you could feel the entire atmosphere of the range shift. Even Garrett looked surprised. Most recreational shooters never even attempt shots beyond 1,000 yards, and here was this quiet woman with the red rifle asking about nearly 2 miles. 2,900 meters? Garrett repeated, his cocky grin faltering just slightly. "That's not a beginner distance, sweetheart. That's extreme long-range shooting. Military sniper territory." Cordelia didn't respond to him. Instead, she turned to Jim Castillo and asked, "Can you set up the target?" Jim hesitated. He'd been watching Cordelia practice for months, had seen her methodical approach and steady improvement, but 2,900 meters was serious business. "Cordelia, that's a hell of a shot. Weather conditions have to be perfect, and even then, can you set it up?" She repeated, her voice calm but firm. Word was already spreading across the range. Shooters were packing up their gear at closer distances and moving to where they could observe. Someone had mentioned the challenge to the range office, and within minutes people were pulling out spotting scopes and rangefinders. This wasn't just about Cordelia anymore. This was about to become a spectacle. Garrett was loving the attention. "This should be entertaining," he told Rick and Danny. "Girls about to learn the difference between playing dress-up and real shooting." But Cordelia had already shifted into a zone I'd seen before. The same focused intensity she used to have in Grandpa Tobias's workshop when she was solving a complex mechanical problem. She walked back to her shooting bag and pulled out a worn leather notebook that I recognized immediately. Grandpa's shooting journal. For the next hour, she did something that silenced even Garrett's running commentary. She turned that shooting challenge into an engineering project. First, she pulled out a weather station device that looked like something NASA might use. Temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, wind speed, and direction at multiple elevations. She recorded everything in precise columns in her grandfather's journal, cross-referencing his notes from similar conditions. "What's she doing?" someone asked. "Calculating," Jim answered with growing respect in his voice. "She's actually calculating the shot." Next came the rifle modifications. Cordelia opened a small toolbox and began making micro-adjustments to her scope mounts, trigger tension, and stock positioning. Each change was deliberate, measured, recorded. She wasn't guessing. She was engineering a solution. "Grandpa," she whispered to the rifle as she worked, "show me what you taught me about reading the wind." The red rifle that had looked so out of place an hour ago now seemed purposeful, almost scientific. Other shooters started asking technical questions about her modifications, and Cordelia answered them with the confidence of someone who understood every component she'd built. "The red coating isn't decorative," she explained to a curious Army veteran. It's a specific thermal treatment that helps with barrel heat, dissipation, and gives me better contrast for wind reading against different backgrounds. Garrett was getting visibly uncomfortable as Cordelia's preparation revealed knowledge that most recreational shooters didn't possess. All the calculations in the world won't help if you can't actually make the shot, he said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. The final phase of her preparation was the most telling. Cordelia set up a spotting scope and spent 20 minutes just watching the target area, studying wind patterns, noting how different air currents affected visibility at various elevations between her position and the target. She made notes about mirage effects and light refraction that impressed even the range's most experienced shooters. "Ma'am," said a retired Navy SEAL who'd been watching quietly, "I've seen military snipers with less thorough preparation than what you just did." As she finally moved into shooting position, Cordelia pulled one more item from her bag. A small red ribbon that she tied around her wrist. I knew exactly what that was. Grandpa Tobias had given it to her on her 16th birthday, telling her it was for luck during important moments. The range fell completely silent as she settled behind her rifle. Every conversation stopped. Every other activity ceased. Even Garrett had nothing to say as Cordelia began her breathing routine, the same controlled pattern Grandpa had taught her years ago in his workshop. "This one's for you." "Grandpa Tobias," she whispered, barely audible. "Show them what real precision looks like." The entire range held its breath. The silence that fell over the Rocky Mountain Precision Range was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. 50-plus shooters, range officers, even the maintenance crew had stopped what they were doing to watch my sister Cordelia settle behind that bright red rifle. You could hear the wind moving through the pine trees 200 yards away. Cordelia's breathing settled into the rhythm Grandpa Tobias had taught her. 4 counts in, hold for 2, 4 counts out. Her body became perfectly still, every muscle relaxed except for the ones needed to maintain her position. Through the spotting scope, I watched her eye align with the scope, her finger move to the trigger guard, then pause. "Wind's shifting," she said quietly to Jim, who was acting as her spotter. "Give me 30 seconds." The wind flags between her position and the distant target were telling a complex story. At 500 yards, the wind was pushing left to right at about 8 miles per hour. At 1,500 yards, it shifted to nearly dead calm. At the target, 2,900 meters away, it was swirling unpredictably around a small ridge. Garrett couldn't help himself. "Clock's ticking, sweetheart. Wind's not going to get any better." Cordelia didn't acknowledge him. She was watching, calculating, waiting for the moment when all the variables aligned. I'd seen this patience before, during her college engineering projects, when she'd wait hours for test conditions to be exactly right. Then it happened. The wind flag settled into a pattern she'd been tracking. The mirage over the distant ridge stabilized. Even the light seemed to steady as a cloud moved away from the sun. "Send it," Jim whispered, though he wasn't sure she'd heard him. The shot came without warning. One moment there was perfect silence. The next there was the sharp crack of the rifle, followed immediately by something that made every experienced shooter on that range take notice. There was no muzzle rise, no disturbed shooting position. The rifle had fired like a precision instrument, not a weapon. Now came the longest 4.2 seconds of everyone's life. At 2,900 meters, even a perfectly aimed bullet takes time to reach its target. Sound travels at 1,125 feet per second. The bullet was moving at nearly 2,800 feet per second, but it still had almost 2 miles to travel. Mathematics and physics were racing toward a distant target while 50 people held their breath. Jim was glued to the high-powered spotting scope, tracking the bullet's path through the scope's field of view. "I see trace," he called out, meaning he could actually see the bullet's vapor trail through the scope. "Looking good, looking good." The seconds stretched like hours. Garrett stood frozen, his earlier cockiness replaced by the growing realization that this might not end the way he'd expected. Rick and Danny weren't making jokes anymore. Even the maintenance crew had stopped pretending to work. "Impact!" Jim's voice cracked with excitement. "Dead center!" "Perfect bullseye at 2,900 meters." The range erupted, but not with the cheers you might expect. Instead, there was stunned silence followed by a dozen voices asking for confirmation. "Are you sure? Let me see that scope. Check the target number. Make sure we're looking at the right one." Jim was laughing now. The kind of disbelieving laughter that comes when you witness something that shouldn't be possible. "Ladies and gentlemen, We have a perfect center ring hit at 2,900 meters. Confirmed and verified. The crowd's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Shooters who'd been skeptical were now pushing forward to congratulate Cordelia, to examine her rifle, to ask about her techniques. But the most powerful moment came when she calmly reached into her shooting bag and pulled out a small logbook. "This wasn't luck," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "I've been hitting targets at this distance consistently for 2 months." She opened the logbook and there it was. Page after page of documented shots, all at extreme long range, all with precise weather data and impact locations recorded in her neat engineering handwriting. Shot after shot at distances that most of the men who'd been mocking her had never even attempted. The revelation hit the crowd like a second shockwave. This quiet woman with the red rifle hadn't gotten lucky. She'd been outperforming every single one of them for months while they were busy bragging about their credentials. Garrett approached slowly, his face red with embarrassment and something that looked like genuine respect. "Ma'am," he said, extending his hand, "I owe you an apology. That was one hell of a shot." But Cordelia's response was even more devastating than the perfect bullseye. She looked him straight in the eye and said, "It wasn't one shot, Garrett. It was 3 years of showing up every day and doing the work while you were busy talking." The range fell silent again, but this time it wasn't anticipation. It was respect. The news of Cordelia's shot spread through the shooting community faster than wildfire in August. Within 24 hours, the video someone had recorded on their phone had been shared across every precision shooting forum and social media group in the country. By the end of the week, my quiet sister who just wanted to honor our grandfather's memory had become something she never expected. A legend. The first call came Tuesday morning while she was at her engineering job. A representative from Precision Rifle Solutions wanted to fly out from Texas to examine her modifications and discuss a potential sponsorship deal. Wednesday brought an invitation to compete in the National Long Range Championship in Wyoming. Thursday, a military contractor asked if she'd be interested in consulting on sniper rifle development. "I just wanted to hit the target," Cordelia told me that weekend as we sat on her back porch, watching her meticulously clean the red rifle. I never expected all this attention. But the most meaningful changes weren't the phone calls or sponsorship offers. They were happening right there at Rocky Mountain Precision Range, where everything had started. Garrett Voss, the same man who'd publicly humiliated her just days before, showed up at her usual Saturday morning practice session with a humble request. "Ma'am, I was wondering if you might be willing to teach me some of your wind reading techniques." I realize I've got a lot to learn. It wasn't just Garrett. Rick and Danny, his former buddies who'd joined in the mockery, were there too, asking respectful questions about her mathematical approach to long-range shooting. The dynamic at the range had completely shifted. Suddenly, everyone wanted to understand how the quiet woman with the engineering degree had achieved what most of them could only dream of. Cordelia handled her newfound fame with the same methodical approach she brought to everything else. She started offering weekend workshops, teaching other shooters the technical principles Grandpa Tobias had taught her, combined with her own engineering insights. Her classes filled up weeks in advance. "The rifle doesn't care what color it is," she'd tell her students. "Physics doesn't care about your military service or how expensive your equipment is. Precision is about understanding variables, respecting the science, and putting in consistent practice." The transformation in our family was just as dramatic. Our parents, Vivian and Hayes, who'd spent years dismissing her tinkering as a phase, suddenly found themselves bragging to their friends about their daughter, the precision shooting champion. Mom started researching ballistics terminology so she could understand Cordelia's explanations at family dinners. Dad, who'd always wanted one of us to take over his insurance business, began talking about the mathematics of risk assessment and how Cordelia's analytical mind could revolutionize the industry. "I always knew she was smart," Dad told me privately, "but I never realized how smart until I watched her turn that hobby into something this significant." The real victory came 6 months later at the National Long Range Championship in Wyoming. Cordelia didn't just compete. She dominated. Her bright red rifle, the same one that had been mocked as a toy, outperformed custom rifles worth more than most people's cars. She won 3 separate categories and set 2 range records that still stand today. But her victory speech was what people remembered most. Standing on the podium in front of 500 of the country's best shooters, she dedicated her win to everyone who's ever been told their approach doesn't look like everyone else's, and to my grandfather Tobias, who taught me that real precision comes from understanding your craft, not from matching everyone else's expectations. The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes. Today, that bright red rifle isn't hanging in a trophy case collecting dust. It's still at Rocky Mountain Precision Range every Saturday morning, still making shots that leave people shaking their heads in amazement. Cordelia uses it to teach a new generation of shooters that expertise doesn't always look like what you expect. That innovation often comes from combining different fields of knowledge, and that the most powerful response to doubt is simply showing up and doing the work. The range that once echoed with mocking laughter now hums with respectful conversation about wind drift, calculations, and ballistic coefficients. And every time a newcomer shows up with equipment that doesn't look traditional, the veterans remember the day a quiet engineer with a red rifle taught them all a lesson in humility. They'll never forget, sometimes the most profound victories aren't won through confrontation or argument. Sometimes they're won through precision, preparation, and the simple act of proving that excellence speaks for itself.